An arrogant millionaire catches a desperate, starving homeless girl clutching his discarded torn shoes from the trash. He cruelly dismisses her until her devastating words strike him like lightning. Uncontrollable tears stream down his face as he falls to his knees begging for forgiveness. But first, every story is a new emotion. Subscribe now and don't miss moments that will surprise you and touch your heart. Richard Campbell stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, 40 stories above Boston's financial district. Rain pounded against the glass, distorting the city below into a blur of grey and twinkling lights. At 54, Richard had amassed wealth beyond measure, but as he gazed at his reflection in the window, silver hair perfectly coiffed, custom Italian suit impeccably tailored, all he saw was emptiness. "Mr. Campbell, your 4 o'clock cancelled," his assistant's voice announced through the intercom. "And the board reports are on your desk for review." "Fine," he replied curtly, not bothering to thank her. He turned from the window and surveyed his office, the rare antiques, the original paintings, the handcrafted furniture, all carefully selected to project power and success. None of it brought him joy anymore, perhaps nothing ever had. Richard settled into his leather chair and absently fingered the small framed photograph on his desk, the only personal item in the sterile space. In it, an elderly couple smiled warmly at the camera, the man's arm protectively around a teenage boy with serious eyes. Martin and Eleanor Campbell, the couple who had rescued him from the state system when he was 14, after years of being shuffled between foster homes. They had given him their name, their home, and for 4 brief years, a glimpse of what family could be. A sharp pain squeezed his chest, not the emotional kind, but the physical warning his cardiologist had cautioned him about. Richard opened his desk drawer and retrieved a small pill bottle, swallowing a tablet without water. Heart issues. The irony wasn't lost on him. The doctors claimed it was congenital, but Richard suspected that years of driving himself relentlessly, of burying grief beneath ambition, had taken their toll. His phone buzzed. A text from his ex-wife, Charlotte. "James's graduation is next month. He's hoping you'll make it this time." Richard grimaced. His son, or rather Charlotte's son from her previous marriage, had never forgiven Richard for missing his high school graduation 6 years ago. Not that Richard blamed him. He'd been a terrible stepfather, always working, always distant. He typed back, "I'll be there," knowing even as he sent it that something would probably come up. Something always did. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Campbell, your driver is waiting," and Ms. Reynolds called again about the Art Gala fundraiser. "Tell her I'll make the donation but won't attend," Richard replied, gathering his things. Social events had become increasingly intolerable. The small talk, the fawning, the inevitable questions about his plans for Campbell Industries, as if he cared about anything beyond the next acquisition, the next victory. Heavy raindrops pelted him as he hurried from the building to his waiting car, a sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows. Gerald, his driver of 15 years, nodded respectfully as he held the door. "Evening, Mr. Campbell." "Straight." "Home?" "Yes," Richard replied, sinking into the leather seat. "And Gerald, take the long way. I'm in no hurry." As the car glided through Boston's rain-slicked streets, Richard closed his eyes, suddenly overwhelmed by fatigue. He'd built Campbell Industries from nothing into one of the largest private equity firms in the country. He owned properties on 3 continents. His net worth fluctuated by millions daily. And yet, as he approached his 55th birthday, he found himself increasingly haunted by a simple question. What was it all for? The car slowed to a stop in front of his Beacon Hill mansion, a stately brownstone that had once belonged to a shipping magnate. Richard had spent a fortune restoring it to period perfection, yet he occupied just 3 rooms of the sprawling space. "Dreadful weather, sir," Gerald commented, opening an umbrella for Richard. "They say it'll continue through the weekend." Richard grunted in acknowledgement, taking the umbrella. "Don't bother coming in tomorrow, Gerald. I'll be working from home." "Very good, sir. Good night." Inside, the house was silent and dark until motion sensors detected his presence, illuminating his path. Richard moved through the grand foyer with its marble floors and sweeping staircase, past rooms filled with curated furniture and art that no one ever enjoyed. In the kitchen, Mrs. Peterson, his housekeeper, had left dinner in the warming drawer with a note. Salmon with spring vegetables. Dessert in the refrigerator. See you Monday. Richard wasn't hungry. Instead, he poured himself 2 fingers of 30-year-old scotch and carried it to his bedroom suite. There, he kicked off his Italian leather shoes, handmade by the same craftsman who had made shoes for his adoptive father, and noticed the worn soles and scuffed leather. Martin had taught him to care for fine shoes, to polish and maintain them, but Richard had grown careless. These would need to be replaced. Slipping into his private dressing room, Richard selected a new pair from his collection, making a mental note to discard the old ones. As he changed out of his suit into more comfortable clothes, he caught sight of himself in the full-length mirror. Despite his fitness regimen and the best efforts of his personal tailor, time was taking its toll. The sharp lines of his face had deepened into permanent creases, and a persistent weariness shadowed his eyes. 54, and what do you have to show for it? He muttered to his reflection. Later, nursing his scotch in his private study, Richard scrolled through emails on his tablet. Acquisitions, divestments, charity requests, invitations, nothing that sparked even the faintest interest. Rain continued to lash against the windows, and somewhere in the big house, a clock ticked steadily, marking time that seemed increasingly precious and wasted. On impulse, Richard opened a secure folder on his tablet. Entering a complex password, photos appeared. Carefully organized documentation of generous donations made anonymously over the years. A children's hospital wing in Eleanor's name, a scholarship fund in Martin's memory, a halfway house for troubled youth. All done with the utmost secrecy, his name nowhere to be found in the public acknowledgements. These were his penance, his attempt to honor the memory of 2 people who had shown him kindness when no one else would. Martin and Eleanor had been wealthy but not ostentatious, generous but not showy. They had taught him that wealth carried responsibility, a lesson he had only partially embraced. Richard closed the folder and shut down the tablet. His chest tightened again, and he massaged the area above his heart, breathing deeply until the sensation passed. The pills weren't working as well as they used to. He made another mental note to call Dr. Winters in the morning. Sleep eluded him that night, as it often did. In the darkness of his bedroom, with rain drumming against the windows, Richard found himself thinking about the path not taken. What if he had worked harder at his marriage? What if he had been a better father to James? What if he had used his wealth differently, more purposefully? Around 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and wandered the silent halls of his mansion, a ghost in his own life. In Martin's study, preserved exactly as it had been when the old man died, Richard ran his fingers along the spines of leather-bound books, remembering how his adoptive father would read aloud from them, trying to instill in him an appreciation for literature, for ideas bigger than profit margins. "I failed you," Richard whispered to the empty room. "Both of you." As dawn broke, grey and subdued behind rain clouds, Richard made a decision. He would clear his calendar for the next month. He would attend James's graduation. He would visit Eleanor's grave, something he hadn't done in years. Perhaps it wasn't too late to reconnect with something authentic, something meaningful. Little did he know that fate had other plans, and they would begin with a pair of discarded shoes and a chance encounter that would shatter the walls he'd built around his heart. The next morning, Richard awoke to the persistent patter of rain against his bedroom windows. His restless night had left him with a dull headache and the lingering unease of half-remembered dreams. After a quick shower and a perfunctory breakfast, he found himself oddly reluctant to begin the workday, despite his intention to work from home. Instead, he wandered to his dressing room, drawn back to the worn Italian shoes he'd noticed the night before. In the harsh morning light, They looked even more dilapidated. The leather cracked along the seams, the once proud craftsmanship reduced to shabby remnants. These had been his favorites, identical to a pair Martin had owned. Richard had commissioned them years ago, a private homage to the man who had saved him. "Time to let go," he muttered, gathering the shoes. Making an uncharacteristic decision, Richard decided to take out his own trash rather than waiting for Mrs. Peterson's Monday visit. Perhaps the small, ordinary task would ground him somehow. He slipped on a raincoat over his casual clothes and carried the shoes and a small bag of other discarded items down the service stairs to the alley behind his home, where the private garbage collection bins were located. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky remained heavy with grey clouds. Richard deposited his bag in the bin and was about to toss in the shoes when a small sound stopped him. A tiny gasp, almost imperceptible beneath the gentle patter of raindrops. He turned, scanning the alley, and froze. Partially hidden behind the neighboring bin was a child, a small girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with tangled brown hair plastered to her head by the rain. Her clothes were soaked and dirty, hanging loosely on her thin frame. But it was her eyes that caught Richard's attention, large, dark, and watching him with a mixture of fear and desperate hunger. Richard stood motionless, shoes still in hand, as the girl's gaze fixed not on him, but on the Italian leather in his grasp. Her expression contained such naked want that he felt an unexpected flash of shame. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he'd intended, uncomfortable with the intrusion into his private world. The girl flinched but didn't run. "I'm sorry, mister," she whispered, her voice small and raspy. "I wasn't stealing nothing." Richard noticed then that she was barefoot, her small feet dirty and reddened from cold. A surge of irritation rose within him, at the girl, at the situation, at the uncomfortable emotions stirring in his chest. "Where are your parents?" he asked sharply. "You shouldn't be digging through trash bins. It's trespassing." The girl's chin quivered, but she stood her ground. "My grandma's sick. She can't work right now." She pointed tentatively at the shoes in his hand. "Are you throwing those away?" Something in her direct question, in the practical concern that overrode her fear, struck Richard. He looked down at the expensive, ruined shoes. "They're worn out," he said, his tone softening slightly. "No good anymore." "They look fixable to me," the girl said with surprising conviction. "My grandma says good shoes just need care, like people." Her gaze returned to his face, sudden hope lighting her features. "If you don't want them." Richard felt a strange reluctance to part with the shoes, despite having intended to discard them moments before. "They wouldn't fit you," he said, aware of how ridiculous the statement was, even as he made it. The girl's face fell, but she nodded with a gravity beyond her years. "I know, but I could trade them for food, maybe. Or," she hesitated, then added with heartbreaking practicality, "or sell them to the shoe repairman. He gives money for fixable things." Richard felt something shift inside him, a hairline crack in a wall he'd spent decades building. This child, this stranger, looked at his discarded possessions and saw not trash but possibility, resources to be salvaged. "Here," he said gruffly, holding out the shoes. "Take them." The girl hesitated, clearly expecting a trap. When Richard didn't move, she darted forward like a small, frightened animal, snatching the shoes from his hands and clutching them to her chest as if they were treasure. "Thank you, mister." Her face brightened momentarily before clouding again. "I'm sorry for being in your trash." She began to back away, the shoes held protectively against her thin body. Richard should have felt relief at her departure. Instead, he felt a strange, uncomfortable pull, a sensation so foreign it took him a moment to recognize it as concern. "Wait," he called, surprising himself. "You're soaked and barefoot." He gestured vaguely up at the sky, at the continuing drizzle. "Where are you going?" The girl paused, uncertainty plain on her face. "Home," she said softly. "My grandma's waiting." "Where's home?" Richard pressed, telling himself he was merely being a responsible citizen, that he would call social services once he had an address. The girl pointed vaguely eastward. Pine Street, by the old factory. Richard knew the area, a neglected neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, far from his manicured Beacon Hill address. The thought of this child walking miles through the rain, barefoot, clutching his discarded shoes, created an image he found suddenly, inexplicably, intolerable. "That's too far to walk in this weather," he said, making a split-second decision that would alter the course of his carefully controlled life. "I can drive you." Alarm flashed across the girl's face. "My grandma says never to go with strangers." "Your grandmother is right," Richard acknowledged, surprised to find himself respecting this invisible guardian's wisdom. "But it's raining, and you have no shoes." He hesitated, then added, "My name is Richard Campbell. Now I'm not a complete stranger." The girl regarded him solemnly, weighing her options with a seriousness that seemed out of place on her young face. Finally, she said, "I'm Emma." "Well, Emma," Richard replied, "will you allow me to drive you home? I promise to take you directly to your grandmother." Still clutching the shoes, Emma nodded cautiously. "Okay, Mr. Campbell, but Grandma Grace might be sleeping. She takes medicine that makes her tired." Richard led the way back to his front garage, uncomfortably aware of the small, soggy figure following several paces behind him. His mind raced with questions. Why was this child scrounging through trash? Where were her parents? What kind of illness kept her grandmother from working? These were not his problems, he reminded himself. He would drive the girl home, perhaps leave some money for food, and be done with it. A simple act of charity, nothing more. At the garage, Richard opened the passenger door of his Porsche, his weekend car, sleek and impractical. Emma hesitated at the sight of the luxury vehicle. "I'll get it dirty," she said, looking down at her soaked, muddy clothes. "It can be cleaned," Richard replied, surprising himself with how little he cared about the imported leather seats. "Get in." As they drove through Boston's rain-slicked streets, Richard became acutely aware of the contrast between himself and his small passenger. Emma sat perched on the edge of the seat, still clutching the shoes, her eyes wide as she took in the car's plush interior. She seemed afraid to touch anything, to disturb the pristine space. "How old are you, Emma?" Richard asked, breaking the awkward silence. 8 1/4, she answered promptly. "And it's just you and your grandmother?" Emma nodded, then hesitated before adding, "My mom died when I was really little. I don't remember her much." She spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity. Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel, unwanted memories surfacing. "I lost my parents when I was young too," he found himself saying. Emma turned to look at him with new interest. "Really? What happened to them?" "Car accident," Richard said shortly, immediately regretting the personal disclosure. He hadn't spoken of his biological parents in decades. "That's sad," Emma said simply. Then, after a pause, "Did you get new ones?" The childish phrasing caught Richard off guard. "Eventually. I was adopted when I was 14. Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That's good. Everyone needs somebody." She turned her attention back to the shoes in her lap, running small fingers over the worn leather. "These are really nice, even if they're old. Thank you for not throwing them away." Richard felt that strange twinge again, discomfort mixed with something he couldn't quite name. "They're just shoes," he said dismissively. Emma shook her head with surprising conviction. "No, they're not. Grandma Grace says you can tell a lot about a person from their shoes. These had a good owner, I think. They're worn from walking, not from being careless." The observation, so close to what Martin Campbell would have said, struck Richard deeply. He remained silent as Emma directed him through increasingly dilapidated neighborhoods, the elegant architecture of Beacon Hill giving way to neglected buildings and vacant lots. Finally, they turned onto Pine Street, a narrow road lined with sagging triple-deckers and abandoned storefronts. Emma pointed to a small grey house set back from the street, its paint peeling, but its tiny front yard neatly kept despite the obvious poverty. Richard parked, a sense of unreality washing over him. What was he doing here, in this neighborhood he normally only saw from the window of his car as he passed through to somewhere else? "That's my house," Emma said, unbuckling her seatbelt with difficulty. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Campbell, and for the shoes." Richard found himself getting out of the car, following as Emma splashed through puddles up the cracked concrete path to the front door. She turned, surprised to find him behind her. "I want to make sure you get in safely," he explained, feeling strangely defensive, "and that your grandmother is home." Emma nodded, accepting this, and pushed open the unlocked door. "Grandma Grace," she called. "I'm home." Richard hesitated on the threshold, suddenly uncertain. He was intruding into these people's lives, driven by an impulse he didn't understand. He should leave now. Forget the girl. Forget this brief detour from his carefully structured existence. But instead, he followed Emma into the small, neat living room, where an elderly woman lay on a worn sofa, a crocheted blanket covering her thin frame. Grace opened her eyes, the same dark eyes as Emma's, and blinked in confusion at the tall, affluent stranger standing awkwardly in her home. "Emma, who is this?" Her voice was weak but clear, tinged with concern. "This is Mr. Campbell," Emma explained, holding up the shoes proudly. "He gave me these instead of throwing them away, and he drove me home because of the rain." Grace struggled to sit up, alarm crossing her pale face. "Emma, you know better than to—" "It's all right," Richard interrupted, feeling a strange need to defend the child. "I found her near my home. It was raining, and she had no shoes. I couldn't let her walk all this way." Grace's eyes, intelligent despite her obvious illness, assessed him carefully. "That was kind of you, Mr. Campbell. Thank you for bringing my granddaughter home safely." There was dignity in her words, pride despite the humble surroundings. Richard found himself respecting it, responding to it. "It was no trouble," he said, then hesitated. The woman's pallor, her labored breathing, spoke of serious illness. He glanced around the small room, clean but Spartan, signs of careful management of extremely limited resources everywhere. Emma had settled beside her grandmother, still clutching the shoes. "Look, Grandma," she said eagerly. "These are real Italian. Leather. The shoeman will give us good money for them." Grace smiled weakly, stroking Emma's damp hair. "Perhaps," she said non-committally, her eyes returning to Richard with a question in them. Richard cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable under that direct gaze. "I should go," he said. He reached for his wallet, intending to leave money, a simple solution, a clean break. But as he began to extract several large bills, Emma spoke again, her attention still on the shoes. "Grandma always says that cracks and breaks just show where something's been loved, that broken things aren't worthless. They just need someone to care enough to fix them." Richard's hand froze, the money half extracted from his wallet. Emma's words, so innocent, so profound, struck him with unexpected force. They echoed in his mind, triggering memories of Martin Campbell saying something similar as they restored an antique desk together, one of the few positive memories from his teenage years. "Remember, Richard, the Japanese have a practice called kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold. They believe that something becomes more beautiful, more valuable, after it's been broken and mended. The same is true of people." Richard stared at Emma, at the worn shoes in her small hands, and something shifted inside him. Tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface of a seemingly stable landscape. Grace was watching him, her expression unreadable. "You've been very kind, Mr. Campbell," she said softly, "but we've taken enough of your time." Richard replaced his wallet without removing the money, suddenly aware that cash would be an insult to this woman's quiet dignity. "Yes," he said distractedly. "I should go." He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back. "Is there—" he began, then stopped, uncertain what he was offering. Grace smiled, understanding in her eyes. "We're managing, Mr. Campbell. Emma and I look after each other. But Richard had seen the pill bottles on the side table, the past-due medical bills partially hidden beneath them. He had noticed the empty refrigerator glimpsed through the kitchen doorway, the persistent chill in the house from inadequate heating. "I have some connections in healthcare," he said carefully. "If you're ill, perhaps I could—" "We don't need charity," Grace interrupted, pride evident in her weak voice. "It wouldn't be charity," Richard found himself saying. "It would be a thank you for reminding me of something important." Grace held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slightly. A tacit acknowledgement of some understanding reached between them. As Richard finally turned to leave, Emma called after him, "Mr. Campbell, will you come visit us again?" Richard paused, one hand on the doorknob. The sensible answer was no. He had done his good deed. There was no reason to return, to entangle himself in these strangers' lives. But as he looked back at the small figure on the sofa, at the earnest face of the child beside her, Richard felt that same inexplicable pull he had experienced in the alley, as if some invisible thread had connected him to these two people, a thread he found himself strangely reluctant to break. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice, "I will." As he walked back to his car in the now gentle rain, Richard felt oddly unmoored, as if he had stepped off a predictable path into unknown territory. He had intended nothing more than to discard an old pair of shoes, and instead had found, what? A purpose? A connection? He wasn't sure. What he did know was that for the first time in years, the persistent emptiness inside him had receded slightly. In its place was something fragile but unmistakable, a sense of possibility, of doors long closed beginning, just barely, to crack open once again. Richard sat in his car outside Emma and Grace's modest home for several minutes, rain drumming on the roof, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it might anchor him against the tide of emotions threatening to pull him under. What had just happened? Why had a chance encounter with a child affected him so deeply? Emma's words echoed in his mind. Cracks and breaks just show where something's been loved. Broken things aren't worthless. They just need someone to care enough to fix them. With a shaking hand, Richard reached for his phone, scrolling to a contact he rarely used. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Richard Campbell, to what do I owe this surprise?" "Dr. Winters," Richard said, gathering his composure. "I need a favor." 20 minutes later, Richard was seated across from Dr. Sarah Winters in her private office at Massachusetts General Hospital. They had a long history. She had been Martin Campbell's physician before becoming Richard's, one of the few constants in his life over the decades. "You look troubled," she observed, studying him with professional detachment, tinged with old affection. "Is it your heart again?" "Not directly," Richard replied, then hesitated before explaining his encounter with Emma and Grace. "The grandmother is clearly very ill. I saw prescription bottles for what looked like serious medication. The child is scrounging in trash bins for things to sell. I want to help them." Dr. Winters leaned back in her chair, a knowing look crossing her face. "And you want me to facilitate this help while maintaining your anonymity as usual?" Richard nodded, uncomfortable with her perception. Over the years, Dr. Winters had been his reluctant accomplice in numerous anonymous charitable acts, medical bills quietly paid, treatments arranged, specialists consulted, all without the recipients ever knowing the source. "I can make some inquiries," she said carefully. "But Richard, why this family? What makes them different from the dozens of others you've helped from a safe distance?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty unusual for him. "There was something about the child, something familiar." Dr. Winters's expression softened. "She reminded you of yourself." Richard started to deny it, then stopped. Had Emma's determined self-sufficiency, her fierce protection of her only family member, struck a chord? Had he recognized in her the same desperate resourcefulness that had helped him survive his early years in the system after his parents' death? Perhaps, he conceded. But it's more than that. She said something about broken things, about how they just need someone to care for them. He shook his head, frustrated by his inability to articulate the impact of those simple words. It was as if Martin was speaking through her. Dr. Winters nodded slowly. Martin Campbell was a wise man. He saw something in a broken, angry 14-year-old boy that others missed. She held Richard's gaze. Perhaps you're being given a chance to do the same. Richard shifted uncomfortably. I just want to make sure they get proper medical care. Nothing more. Of course, Dr. Winters replied, her tone making it clear she didn't believe him. Give me the grandmother's name and address. I'll see what I can find out discreetly. As Richard provided Grace's information, he felt a strange sense of commitment forming, as if by speaking her name aloud to someone else, he was acknowledging that these people had somehow become his responsibility. There's something else you should know, Dr. Winters said as he prepared to leave. Your last test results weren't good, Richard. The medication isn't working as effectively as we'd hoped. We need to discuss more aggressive treatment options. Richard waved away her concern. Schedule whatever you think necessary. I'll make time. But as he left the hospital, his thoughts were not on his own health, but on the small grey house on Pine Street, and the two people inside it who had unexpectedly breached walls he'd thought impenetrable. The following morning, Richard found himself doing something unprecedented, cancelling meetings. His assistant's surprise was evident even over the phone. For the entire week, Mr. Campbell, but the merger discussions, Jeffrey can handle them, Richard interrupted, naming his capable but underutilized CFO. Family emergency. The lie came easily, though Richard had no family to have emergencies. No family except James, his former stepson, who had stopped considering him family years ago. By noon, Richard had received a call from Dr. Winters with information about Grace Palmer. The diagnosis was grim. Advanced lung cancer, complicated by years of inadequate health care. She had been a seamstress, supporting Emma since the child's mother, Grace's daughter, had died of a drug overdose shortly after Emma's birth. Grace had been refusing hospitalization, determined to remain home with her granddaughter for fear the child would be placed in foster care. The foster system. The words sent a chill through Richard. His own experiences, the overcrowded homes, the indifferent caregivers, the constant sense of being unwanted, rose in his memory with surprising clarity. The thought of bright, resilient Emma disappearing into that system was suddenly intolerable. What can be done? He asked Dr. Winters. Medically, we can arrange home care, pain management. But Richard, this is terminal, months at most. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. And the child? Without other relatives. Coming forward, foster care is the likely outcome. After ending the call, Richard sat in his study, an unfamiliar sense of urgency building within him. For decades, he had lived reactively, responding to market changes, to business opportunities, but never to human need, not directly. His charitable giving, substantial though it was, had been conducted at a safe distance, with careful anonymity. Now, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he felt compelled toward direct action. But what action? What did he, Richard Campbell, with his emotional detachment and his carefully ordered life, have to offer a dying woman and her vulnerable granddaughter? As if in answer, his gaze fell on a framed photograph he kept hidden in his desk drawer. Himself at 15, standing awkwardly between Martin and Eleanor Campbell on the day his adoption was finalized. He remembered his disbelief, his suspicion that their kindness concealed ulterior motives, his resistance to their attempts to include him in their lives, and he remembered Martin's patience, his steady presence, his refusal to be deterred by Richard's anger and fear. Being a parent isn't about fixing a child, Martin had told him once. It's about being the safe place where they can heal themselves. Richard had never understood that sentiment, until now, perhaps. The realization that he wanted to be that safe place for Emma both terrified and compelled him. Before he could reconsider, Richard was in his car, driving toward Pine Street. He stopped at a grocery store on the way, filling a cart with essentials, fresh fruits and vegetables, high-quality proteins, staples for the pantry. The domestic task felt foreign to him. Richard couldn't remember the last time he'd shopped for his own food, let alone for others. At the checkout, he added a small stuffed bear on impulse, soft, with dark brown fur and a gentle expression. The kind of comfort object he had secretly longed for during his years in foster care. As he approached the Palmer house, Richard experienced a moment of doubt. What was he doing? These people weren't his responsibility. This impulsive behavior was unlike him, potentially unwelcome, certainly unprofessional. But when Emma opened the door, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at the sight of him, the doubt receded. "Mr. Campbell, you came back." Her delight seemed so pure, so uncalculated, that Richard felt something loosen in his chest. "I brought some groceries," he said, awkwardly holding up the bags. Emma's eyes widened. "Grandma," she called over her shoulder, "Mr. Campbell brought food." Grace was seated in a threadbare armchair, wrapped in blankets despite the day's warmth. Her face showed surprise, then caution as Richard entered. "Mr. Campbell, this is unexpected." Richard set the groceries on the small kitchen counter, suddenly aware of how his action might appear. "I was in the neighborhood," he lied, "and I thought, I remembered Emma mentioning you weren't feeling well." Grace's expression softened slightly. Very thoughtful, but unnecessary. "Wow!" Emma exclaimed, exploring the bags. "Real strawberries and chocolate milk." She turned to Richard, her eyes shining with a gratitude that made him deeply uncomfortable. No child should be so grateful for basic food. "There's something else," Richard said, removing the stuffed bear from the last bag and holding it out awkwardly. Emma stared at the toy, then at Richard, uncertainty crossing her face. "For me?" "Yes." Richard felt foolish suddenly. The girl was 8, perhaps too old for stuffed animals. "If you want it." Emma approached slowly, reaching for the bear with a reverence that spoke volumes about how few new things had come into her life. She hugged it to her chest, a smile breaking across her face. "Thank you, Mr. Campbell. I'm going to name him Martin." Richard froze. "What did you say?" "Martin," Emma repeated, puzzled by his reaction. "Is that a bad name?" "No," Richard said, his voice strained. "It's a fine name. It was my father's name. My adoptive father." Emma's eyes widened. "Really? That's a sign then. Grandma says when coincidences happen, it means you're on the right path." Richard glanced at Grace, who was watching the interaction with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Emma," Grace said gently, "why don't you put the groceries away while I talk to Mr. Campbell?" Emma nodded, carefully setting Martin the bear on a shelf before turning to the task, humming softly to herself. Grace gestured for Richard to sit in the chair opposite her. "Mr. Campbell," she began, her voice low, "your kindness is appreciated, but I have to ask, why? We're strangers to you." Richard struggled to articulate an answer that would make sense, that wouldn't reveal too much of his own broken past or the inexplicable connection he felt. "Your granddaughter," he finally said. "She has a way of seeing value in discarded things, in broken things." He hesitated, then added, "It's a rare quality." Grace studied him, seeming to look beyond his expensive clothes and carefully constructed facade. "Mr. Campbell, I've lived long enough to recognize when someone is searching for something. Whatever brought you to our door, it wasn't just kindness to strangers." Richard shifted uncomfortably under her perceptive gaze. "Perhaps I recognize something in Emma. A resilience I once needed myself." Grace nodded slowly. "She's special, my Emma. Has been since she was tiny. Sees the world differently." She paused, a spasm of pain crossing her face. "Mr. Campbell, I don't have much time left. The doctors have been clear about that." "I know," Richard said quietly. Grace's eyes sharpened. "How would you know that?" Richard hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I have connections at Massachusetts General. I asked about your condition." Instead of the anger he expected, Grace laughed softly. "Well, that's direct at least." Her expression grew serious again. "Then you understand my concern. What happens to Emma when I'm gone keeps me awake at night." Richard leaned forward. "Are there no relatives who could take her?" Grace shook her head. "My daughter was my only child. Her father, Emma's grandfather, left years ago. There's no one else." She looked toward the kitchen where Emma was carefully arranging the groceries, still humming. "They'll put her in the system foster care." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Richard's throat tightened as memories surfaced. Cold bedrooms in strangers' homes, indifferent caretakers, the constant sense of being temporary, unwanted. "That can't happen," he said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. Grace studied him with renewed interest. "You were in foster care yourself, weren't you? Before your adoption?" Richard nodded stiffly. 4 years, 4 homes, until the Campbells took me in. And now you've wandered into our lives, just when Emma needs someone most." Grace's expression was unreadable. "Coincidence, Mr. Campbell? Or something else?" Richard had no answer. He didn't believe in fate or divine intervention. His world was built on calculated risks and predictable returns. And yet, here he was, sitting in a stranger's home, experiencing an inexplicable certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. "I want to help," he said simply. "Not just with groceries or medical care. I want to ensure Emma doesn't end up where I did." Grace closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. "I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Campbell. But taking responsibility for a child isn't like making a donation or serving on a charity board. It's messy, complicated. It demands everything of you. I understand that." "Do you?" Grace asked, her gaze penetrating. "With respect, Mr. Campbell, you strike me as someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding messy and complicated." The observation, so accurate it stung, left Richard momentarily speechless. Before he could formulate a response, Emma returned from the kitchen, the bear clutched in. One arm. "All put away, Grandma," she announced. She turned to Richard, her expression earnest. "Mr. Campbell, would you like to see my drawings? I make cards to sell at the church bazaar. Grandma says I have talent." Richard found himself nodding, grateful for the interruption. "I'd like that very much, Emma." As Emma raced to retrieve her artwork, Grace spoke quietly. "Think carefully about what you're offering, Mr. Campbell. Emma has had enough loss in her young life. I won't allow her to form an attachment to someone who might disappear when things get difficult." Richard met her gaze steadily. "I won't disappear." Grace's reply was interrupted by Emma's return, her arms full of carefully drawn cards. "Look," she said proudly, spreading them on the coffee table. "This one's my favorite." Richard examined the drawings, surprisingly skilled for a child her age. One in particular caught his attention. A simple sketch of a broken teacup, its pieces rejoined with gold lines, in a style reminiscent of the Japanese kintsugi that Martin had taught him about. "This is remarkable," he said, genuinely impressed. "Where did you learn about this technique?" Emma beamed at his interest. "There was a book at the library about Japanese art. The librarian let me copy pages before it had to go back." She pointed to the gold lines. "See how the breaks make it more beautiful? That's what Grandma always says about people too." Richard felt the room spin slightly, Martin's voice overlapping with Emma's in his mind. "The same is true of people." "Mr. Campbell?" Grace's concerned voice broke through his reverie. "Are you all right? You've gone quite pale." Richard composed himself with effort. "I'm fine. Just reminded of something." He turned the drawing over in his hands. "Emma, would you consider selling this one to me?" Emma's eyes widened. "Really? You want to buy my drawing?" "I do. It's excellent work." Emma looked to her grandmother, who nodded slightly. "How much?" Emma asked, suddenly businesslike in a way that made Richard smile despite himself. $20, he offered. Emma's mouth fell open. 20 whole dollars for one card? It's worth it, Richard said seriously. Quality deserves fair payment. As Richard reached for his wallet, his phone rang. Checking the screen, he saw it was Dr. Winters. "Excuse me," he said, stepping into the small hallway to take the call. "Richard," Dr. Winters said without preamble, "I've arranged for home hospice care for Mrs. Palmer. A nurse will visit daily, and all medications will be provided. I've also spoken with a pediatric psychiatrist colleague about support for the child." "Thank you, Sarah," Richard replied quietly. "But there's been a development. I'm considering a more personal involvement." A long silence followed. Then, "Richard, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but the possibility is not as foreign as I would have expected." "You're talking about becoming a guardian to this child," Dr. Winters said, her tone careful. "That's not a decision to make impulsively." "I'm aware," Richard replied. "But sometimes, Sarah, the right path is clear, even when it's unexpected." After ending the call, Richard returned to the living room to find Emma carefully writing "sold" on the back of her drawing. Grace was watching her granddaughter with a mixture of love and sorrow that pierced Richard unexpectedly. "The hospice team will start tomorrow," he said quietly to Grace as Emma concentrated on her task. "Dr. Winters has arranged everything." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've been so worried about leaving her alone when I can't get up anymore." Richard hesitated, then reached out awkwardly to touch her frail hand. "You won't be alone, either of you." Later, as Richard prepared to leave, Emma handed him the carefully packaged drawing. "It's in a protective sleeve," she explained seriously, "so it doesn't get damaged." Richard accepted it with equal seriousness. "I'll treasure it, Emma." As he stepped onto the porch, Emma followed him, clutching Martin the bear. "Will you come back tomorrow, Mr. Campbell?" Richard looked down at her hopeful face, realizing with a start that he wanted nothing more than to return. "Yes," he promised, "tomorrow and the day after that." Emma smiled, a flash of pure joy that seemed to illuminate her entire being. "Good, because I think you need us as much as we need you." The statement, so direct, so perceptive, left Richard momentarily speechless. Before he could respond, Emma had darted back inside, leaving him alone with the uncomfortable truth of her words echoing in his mind. On the drive back to his empty mansion, Richard found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He laughed. A genuine laugh, tinged with the absurdity of his situation. Here he was, Richard Campbell, feared corporate raider, notorious for his emotional detachment, suddenly contemplating guardianship of an 8-year-old girl he'd met by chance. What would his board think? His business associates? Charlotte and James? The thought of their reactions sobered him slightly, but didn't diminish the strange certainty growing within him. As he pulled into his garage, Richard's phone rang again, this time his assistant. "Mr. Campbell, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's an urgent matter with the Singapore acquisition. The board is requesting an emergency meeting." "Tomorrow?" Richard hesitated only briefly. "Tell them I'm unavailable. Jeffrey can handle it." "Unavailable," his assistant repeated, clearly confused by this unprecedented response. "But sir, you've been pursuing this acquisition for months." "Things change, Sandra," Richard replied, surprised by his own calm. "Priorities change." After ending the call, Richard made his way to Martin's study, switching on the antique desk lamp that cast a warm glow over the book-lined walls. He hadn't spent significant time in this room in years, finding it too full of memories, too laden with reminders of his own failures to live up to Martin's example. Now, he settled into the leather chair that still held the impression of Martin's form and opened the desk drawer where he kept important personal documents. From inside, he withdrew his will, a document he reviewed annually with cold precision, dividing his considerable assets between investment funds, charitable foundations, and a small provision for James, despite their estrangement. Nothing in it reflected human connection or legacy beyond financial considerations. Richard reached for a pen, and on the legal pad Martin had always kept on the desk, began to write amendments, provisions for Emma's care and education, for Grace's medical expenses, for the establishment of a trust that would secure Emma's future regardless of what happened to him. As his pen moved across the paper, Richard felt a weight lifting, the burden of isolation he had carried for so long, the emptiness that no amount of wealth or power had been able to fill. For the first time in decades, he was making decisions not based on profit or loss, but on human need, on connection. The realization both terrified and exhilarated him. When he finally set down his pen, dawn was breaking. Richard stood and moved to the window, watching as golden light spilled over the city. He thought of Emma's drawing, the broken cup made more beautiful by its repairs, and wondered if perhaps his own broken life might still have the chance to become something whole. Over the next 3 weeks, Richard Campbell did something unprecedented. He rearranged his entire life around 2 people he barely knew. The man who had once refused to adjust a meeting time for a billion-dollar client now structured his days around Grace's medical appointments and Emma's school schedule. The transformation was not without its challenges. Richard's board members reacted with alarm to his sudden decrease in availability. His assistant looked at him as if he'd suffered a brain injury. His ex-wife Charlotte called, having heard rumors of his strange behavior, to ask if he was having some kind of breakdown. "I'm fine, Charlotte," Richard assured her, seated in Grace's small living room while Emma worked on homework at the kitchen table. "Better than I've been in years, actually." People are talking, Richard," Charlotte replied, concern evident in her voice despite their difficult history. "Jeffrey says you've delegated major decisions, missed board meetings. That's not like you." Richard watched as Emma stuck her tongue out in concentration, carefully printing math equations. "Perhaps I'm changing. At 54, because of some charity case." The dismissive comment ignited a flash of anger in Richard. "They're not a charity case, Charlotte. They're people I care about." A loaded silence followed this statement, one that surprised Richard himself. Care, such a simple word, yet one he had excised from his vocabulary decades ago, finding it too dangerous, too unpredictable. "Well," Charlotte finally said, her tone softening, "James will be pleased. He's always said there was a heart somewhere beneath all that armor." The mention of his stepson sent a pang through Richard. "How is he?" "Excited about graduation. Nervous too. He'd still like you to come." "I'll be there," Richard promised, meaning it this time. After ending the call, Richard joined Emma at the table, helping her with a particularly challenging math problem. Grace watched from her recliner, her condition deteriorating, but her mind still sharp. "You're good at explaining things," she observed, as Richard patiently walked Emma through the solution. Richard glanced up, surprised by the compliment. "My father, Martin, was a teacher before he went into business. He always said, understanding came before memorization." "Smart man," Grace nodded. "Emma, when you're finished, it's time for your medicine." Richard had quickly learned that your medicine was their code for Grace's pain medication, which often left her drowsy and confused. Emma had taken on the role of medication manager with the solemnity of a much older child, carefully tracking times and doses on a chart they kept on the refrigerator. As Emma administered the medication with careful precision, Richard was struck again by the role reversal between grandmother and child. Emma, at 8, demonstrated a level of responsibility and compassion that shamed many adults he knew. "Mr. Campbell," Emma said, after tucking a blanket around her now drowsy grandmother, "can we go to the park tomorrow? Ms. Rodriguez said we should get sunshine for vitamin D." Ms. Rodriguez was the hospice nurse who visited daily, providing not only medical care for Grace, but guidance for Emma on how to maintain her own health during this difficult time. Richard had been impressed by her no-nonsense manner and her genuine concern for both patients, the dying woman and the child caring for her. "The park sounds like an excellent idea," Richard agreed. "I'll pick you up after school." Emma beamed, then grew serious. But only if Grandma feels okay. And Ms. Rodriguez says it's all right. Richard nodded, respecting her priorities. Of course. Later, as Grace slept and Emma worked on a new drawing at the kitchen table, Richard stepped outside to take a call from his cardiologist. "Your latest results are concerning, Richard," Dr. Winters said without preamble. "The arrhythmia is more pronounced, and there's evidence of further valve deterioration. We need to discuss surgical options." Richard rubbed his chest absently, acknowledging the increased frequency of pain he'd been experiencing. "Schedule whatever tests you need. But Sarah, there's something else we need to discuss." He outlined the decision he'd been contemplating, to seek legal guardianship of Emma after Grace's passing. "I've already spoken with family court lawyers. Given my financial resources and Emma's lack of other family, they believe it's possible. But my health situation could complicate things." Dr. Winters finished for him. "Richard, are you certain about this? Taking on parenthood at your age, with your health concerns?" "I've never been more certain of anything," Richard interrupted. "She needs me, Sarah, and I—" He hesitated, unaccustomed to such admissions. "I need her too." Dr. Winters was silent for a moment. "You've changed," she finally said. "Yes," Richard agreed simply. "Bring Emma with you to your next appointment," Dr. Winters suggested. "I'd like to meet this child who's managed what decades of my medical advice couldn't accomplish." When Richard returned inside, he found Emma adding final touches to her drawing, another kintsugi-inspired piece, this one depicting a broken heart mended with gold. "Is that for your art collection?" Richard asked, sitting beside her. Emma nodded. "It's for the hospital. Ms. Rodriguez says art helps people feel better when they're sick." She looked up at him, her expression serious. "Mr. Campbell, why do you keep rubbing your chest? Does your heart hurt?" Richard was taken aback by her perception. "Sometimes," he admitted, "I have a heart condition. Nothing for you to worry about." Emma considered this. "Grandma says everyone's heart hurts sometimes. Some from sickness, some from sadness." She pushed the drawing toward him. "Maybe you need this more than the hospital does." Richard accepted the drawing, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Thank you, Emma. I think perhaps I do." The next afternoon found Richard and Emma at the local park, enjoying a rare sunny day. Grace had been having a good morning, alert and comfortable enough that she insisted they go ahead with their plans while Ms. Rodriguez stayed with her. "Hiya, Mr. Campbell," Emma called, her legs pumping as Richard pushed her on the swing. Her laughter, unrestrained and joyful, drew smiles from nearby parents who assumed Richard was her grandfather. Richard found himself laughing too, the sound rusty but genuine. When was the last time he had visited a park? Had he ever pushed a child on a swing before? He couldn't remember doing so with James, who had been 12 when Richard married Charlotte, already too old for such games. After the swings, Emma led him to the small pond where ducks gathered, pulling a bag of appropriate duck feed from her backpack. "The bread isn't good for them," she explained seriously. "Ms. Wright at school taught us that." Richard watched as she carefully distributed the feed, making sure even the smallest ducklings received their share. Her natural empathy, her instinctive care for vulnerable creatures, moved him deeply. "Emma," he said as they sat on a bench watching the ducks, "there's something important I'd like to discuss with you." Emma turned to him, immediately attentive. She had learned early that important discussions usually involved her grandmother's illness. "Your grandmother and I have been talking," Richard began carefully, "about what will happen when she can't take care of you anymore." Emma's expression didn't change, but she pulled Martin the bear closer to her chest. "She's going to heaven soon," she said matter-of-factly. "Like my mom did." Richard nodded, impressed by her directness. "Yes, and when that happens, you'll need someone to take care of you." "Ms. Rodriguez said I might go to a foster home," Emma said quietly, "with strangers." The resignation in her voice broke something in Richard. That's what I wanted to talk about. I was wondering how you would feel about coming to live with me instead." Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "With you? In your big house?" "Yes," Richard confirmed. "I would become your guardian, like a parent. You would have your own room, continue at your school, keep all your things." He hesitated, then added, "If that's something you might want." Emma stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to Richard's alarm, her eyes filled with tears. "You want me? Really?" The question, so simple yet laden with the weight of abandonment and uncertainty, pierced Richard to his core. How many times had he asked himself the same question as a child, moving from foster home to foster home, before the Campbells had finally answered, "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "Very much." Emma launched herself at him then, thin arms wrapping around his neck with surprising strength. "Yes," she whispered against his shoulder. "Yes, please." Richard held her awkwardly at first, then more securely, feeling the dampness of her tears against his neck. Something tight and painful in his chest seemed to loosen, making it easier to breathe, despite the physical discomfort of his condition. "We'll need to talk to your grandmother," he said, when Emma finally pulled back. "Make sure she's comfortable with the arrangement." Emma nodded solemnly. "Grandma likes you. She said you have sad eyes but a good heart." She placed a small hand on Richard's chest, directly over the organ in question. "Even if it's a little broken." Richard covered her hand with his own, momentarily speechless at the child's intuition. "We should head back," he finally managed. "Your grandmother will be waiting." As they walked hand in hand back toward the car, Richard found himself contemplating the strange path that had led him here. From discarded shoes to a park bench where he had just, in essence, offered to become a father at 54. The old Richard Campbell would have called it madness. The new Richard, the one emerging day by day through his connection with Emma and Grace, recognized it as something else entirely: salvation. When they returned to the small house on Pine Street, they found Grace sitting up in bed, color in her cheeks for the first time in days. Ms. Rodriguez had helped her bathe and change into a pretty blouse rather than the usual nightgown. A special effort that spoke volumes about Grace's awareness of her limited time. "You two look happy," she observed, as Emma bounced into the room, full of stories about ducks and swings and a dog they had petted. "Mr. Campbell said I can live with him when you go to heaven," Emma announced without preamble, causing Richard to wince at her directness. "In his big house, and I can keep all my things and stay at my school." Grace's eyes met Richard's over Emma's head. Gratitude and question mingled in her gaze. "Did he now? Well, that's something we should all discuss together, isn't it?" Later, after Emma had gone to her room to prepare for bed, Richard sat beside Grace, explaining his proposal in detail. The legal arrangements he'd begun exploring, the provisions he'd made for Emma's future, the changes he was prepared to make in his own life to accommodate a child. "You've thought this through," Grace acknowledged, impressed despite her caution. "As much as possible," Richard agreed. "Though I have no illusions about the challenges." Grace studied him, her gaze penetrating despite her frailty. "You're a successful man, Mr. Campbell, used to solving problems with money and influence, but Emma isn't a problem to be solved. She's a child, complicated, emotional, unpredictable. I understand that. Do you?" Grace pressed. "Raising a child means facing your own weaknesses, your own wounds. Are you prepared for that?" Richard considered the question seriously. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm willing to try for Emma and perhaps for myself as well." Grace nodded slowly. "Honesty. That's a good start." She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I've been praying for an answer, Mr. Campbell. For someone to love Emma when I no longer can. I never expected it would be a millionaire who found her going through his trash." Richard smiled at the unlikely scenario. "Neither did I. Life has strange ways of giving us what we need, not what we think we want," Grace mused. She squeezed his hand once more. "If Emma is comfortable with this arrangement, then you have my blessing." Relief washed over Richard, followed by a sobering awareness of the responsibility he was accepting. "I'll do my best by her," he promised. "I won't let either of you down." Grace's eyes were knowing. "It won't be easy. There will be days when you question this decision, when Emma tests every ounce of your patience and resolve." "I expect so. And there's your health to consider," Grace added, gesturing to his chest. "Emma mentioned your heart condition." Richard grimaced. "She's observant. Yes, I have some cardiac issues, but they're manageable, and I've made arrangements in case—" He trailed off, unwilling to consider that scenario. "In case you leave her too," Grace finished for him. "We must be practical about these things, Mr. Campbell. Children need security, contingency plans." "She'll be secure," Richard assured her. "Financially, legally, and emotionally. I promise you that." Grace seemed satisfied with his response. "Then I can go in peace, knowing my Emma will be cared for." Her eyes grew distant. "And perhaps, in caring for her, you might find healing for your own heart. The kind no doctor can provide." The insight, so similar to what Dr. Winters had suggested, left Richard momentarily speechless. Was his need for connection, for purpose beyond wealth accumulation, so transparent? Or was Grace Palmer simply extraordinarily perceptive? A small sound from the doorway drew their attention. Emma stood there in her pajamas, Martin the bear tucked under one arm, her expression uncertain. "I can't sleep," she admitted. "Can I sit with you and Mr. Campbell for a little while, Grandma?" Grace held out her arms, and Emma climbed carefully onto the bed beside her. Richard watched as grandmother and granddaughter settled together, Emma's head tucked beneath Grace's chin in a practiced motion that spoke of countless such moments. "Mr. Campbell was just agreeing to be your guardian," Grace told Emma, stroking her hair. "If that's truly what you want." Emma nodded against her grandmother's shoulder. "It is." She turned to look at Richard, her expression suddenly worried. "But will you be my family? Like real family, not just a guardian?" The question caught Richard off guard. "What do you mean by real family?" he asked carefully. Emma frowned, considering. "Family means you stay even when things are hard, even when I'm bad or sad or sick. Family means forever, not just until something better comes along." The definition, so simple yet profound, rendered Richard momentarily speechless. How many families had failed to meet that standard during his years in foster care? How had he himself failed to provide that security for James? "Yes, Emma," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to be your real family. Forever." Emma studied him intently, as if searching for any sign of insincerity. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded once, decisively. "Okay. Then I want you to be my family too." She hesitated, then added with heartbreaking practicality, "But we should have a trial period first. That's what they do with adoptions, to make sure it's a good fit." Richard couldn't help but smile at her mature approach. "A wise suggestion. How long do you think this trial period should last?" Emma considered the question seriously. 2 weeks? That's how long Mrs. Abernathy had her foster dog before she adopted him for real. Grace stifled a laugh, and Richard found himself chuckling despite the gravity of the situation. 2 weeks seems reasonable, he agreed solemnly. Later, after Emma had finally fallen asleep and Richard was preparing to leave, Grace called him back to her bedside. "Mr. Campbell," she said, her voice weaker now, the evening's exertion taking its toll. "There's a small box in my dresser drawer, the blue one with the silver clasp. Would you bring it to me?" Richard found the box easily, a faded velvet jewelry case that had seen better days. He handed it to Grace, who opened it with trembling fingers to reveal a simple gold locket on a delicate chain. "This belonged to my mother and her mother before her," Grace explained. "It's the only thing of value I have to pass on." She removed the locket from its case. Inside is a picture of Emma's mother, my daughter Rebecca, and a lock of Emma's baby hair. She held it out to Richard. I'd like you to keep it for Emma. Give it to her when she's older, when she's ready to understand her history, where she came from." Richard accepted the locket with appropriate solemnity, recognizing the significance of the gesture. Grace was entrusting him not just with Emma's future, but with her past as well, the connections to family that would help shape her identity. "I'll keep it safe," he promised, "and make sure she knows the stories that go with it." Grace nodded, satisfied. "Our stories are who we are, Mr. Campbell, the ones we're born with and the ones we create for ourselves." She fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "I think perhaps you and Emma are beginning a new story together, one that might heal you both." As Richard drove home that night, the locket secure in his pocket, he found himself contemplating Grace's words. A new story, a second chance. Concepts he had dismissed as sentimental nonsense for most of his adult life now seemed not only possible, but vital. He thought of the drawing Emma had given him, the broken heart mended with gold, and wondered if perhaps his own damaged heart, both literally and figuratively, might yet be repaired through this unexpected connection with a child who saw value in broken things. 2 weeks later, Grace Palmer slipped away peacefully in her sleep, Emma curled against her side, and Richard keeping vigil in the chair beside the bed. The end, when it came, was gentle, a quiet exhalation followed by stillness. Emma, exhausted from days of tending to her grandmother, didn't wake immediately, giving Richard a moment to absorb the reality of Grace's passing and prepare himself for what would come next. When Emma finally stirred, blinking up at her grandmother's still face, Richard held his breath, uncertain what to expect. Would there be hysteria? Denial? The child had experienced too much loss already in her young life. Instead, Emma sat up slowly, placed a kiss on Grace's forehead, and whispered, "Goodbye, Grandma. Say hi to Mommy for me." Then she turned to Richard, her eyes filled with tears but her voice steady. "She's not hurting anymore." Richard moved to sit beside her on the bed, awkwardly putting an arm around her small shoulders. "No, she's not hurting anymore." Emma leaned against him, silent tears soaking into his shirt. They sat together like that for a long time, the child and the man, united in grief and an uncertain future. The next days passed in a blur of practical arrangements. The modest funeral Grace had planned and paid for in advance, the legal formalities of Emma's temporary placement in Richard's care while permanent guardianship was arranged, the careful packing of the small house's contents. Emma approached these tasks with the same solemn efficiency she had shown during her grandmother's illness. But Richard noticed concerning signs: her refusal to cry after that first morning, her mechanical responses to well-meaning condolences, the dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Dr. Sarah Winters, who had attended the funeral despite never having met Grace, pulled Richard aside during the small reception afterward. "She's in shock," she said quietly, watching as Emma methodically arranged cookies on a plate. "Children process grief differently than adults. Don't expect it to be linear or predictable." Richard nodded, grateful for the guidance. "What should I do?" "Be consistent, be present, and be prepared for the dam to break, possibly when you least expect it." That moment came 3 days later as Richard was helping Emma settle into her new room in his Beacon Hill mansion. He had hired a designer to transform a guest suite into a child's bedroom, with input from Emma on colors and furnishings. The result was lovely, but impersonal, a magazine-worthy child's room that hadn't yet acquired the lived-in feeling of a true refuge. Emma had been quiet as she unpacked her few possessions, carefully arranging her drawings and books on the new shelves, placing Martin the bear in a position of honor on the bed. Richard stood in the doorway, trying to give her space while remaining available, when Emma pulled a worn photo album from her suitcase. "Grandma made this," she said, the first unprompted words she'd spoken all day. "It has pictures of my mom and of me when I was a baby. Would you like to show it to me?" Richard asked gently. Emma nodded, patting the spot beside her on the bed. Richard sat down, careful to maintain a respectful distance as Emma opened the album. Together they looked through photos of a smiling young woman with Emma's eyes holding a tiny baby, of Grace looking younger and happier, of Emma's early birthdays and first steps. "Grandma said my mom loved me very much," Emma said, tracing a photo of her mother's face. "But she got sick with drugs and couldn't get better." Richard nodded, unsure what to say to this matter-of-fact description of addiction. "Grandma said sometimes people's pain is too big for them to carry, and they try to make it go away in ways that hurt them more," Emma continued. "She said it wasn't because my mom didn't love me enough." "Your grandmother was very wise," Richard said quietly. Emma turned the page to a photo of herself at perhaps 5, sitting on Grace's lap as they read a book together. Her small finger traced Grace's smiling face. "I'm afraid," she whispered, her voice suddenly tight. "What are you afraid of, Emma?" Richard asked, though he thought he knew. "I'm afraid I'll forget her," Emma said, her voice breaking. "Like I forgot my mom. I don't really remember my mom, only what Grandma told me about her." And now, a sob escaped her, the first since the morning of Grace's death. "Now I'm afraid I'll forget Grandma too, and then it will be like they were never real." The dam broke then. Weeks of carefully contained grief pouring out in gut-wrenching sobs that shook her small frame. Richard hesitated only briefly before gathering Emma into his arms, holding her as she wept for her mother, her grandmother, her lost childhood. "You won't forget her," he promised, his own voice rough with emotion. "We won't let that happen. We'll talk about her, look at pictures, remember her favorite sayings." He stroked Emma's hair as her sobs began to subside. "And I knew her too, Emma. Not for long, but long enough to see how extraordinary she was, how much she loved you. I can help you remember." Emma pulled back slightly, her face tear-streaked and vulnerable. "Promise?" "I promise," Richard said firmly. "Grace will always be part of our family, even though she's gone." Emma considered this, hiccuping slightly. "Our family," she repeated, testing the words. "You and me." "Yes," Richard confirmed. "You and me." Emma leaned against him again, emotionally exhausted. "I miss her so much," she whispered. "I know," Richard said, the simple acknowledgement more honest than platitudes about time healing all wounds. "I know you do." That night, long after Emma had finally fallen asleep, Richard sat in Martin's study, the photo album open on his lap. He studied the images of Rebecca Palmer, Emma's mother, a young woman who had lost her battle with addiction, and of Grace, who had stepped in to raise her granddaughter with love and wisdom despite limited resources. These women were part of Emma's story, essential pieces of her identity. Richard realized with sudden clarity that his responsibility extended beyond providing material security for Emma. He needed to help her preserve these connections, honor these relationships that had shaped her. In the months following Grace's death, Richard and Emma established their new life together. Richard officially becomes Emma's legal guardian, rearranging his work schedule to be present for school events and creating new routines that provide stability. Emma experiences ups and downs in her grief, sometimes pulling away emotionally, other times clinging to Richard with desperate need. Richard's heart condition worsens, prompting Dr. Winters to recommend surgical intervention. During pre-operative testing, they discover Richard needs a heart transplant. When Emma learns about the severity of his condition, she shows remarkable strength, becoming his fierce advocate and support. She creates special drawings for the hospital staff, caring for Richard, and researches heart health with determined focus. While awaiting a donor heart, Richard finalizes adoption proceedings to make Emma legally his daughter. The ceremony is small but meaningful, attended by Dr. Winters, Ms. Rodriguez, and Jeffrey from the office, who has unexpectedly become a supporter of Richard's new life priorities. Richard gives Emma the family locket from Grace, adding a small photo of Grace, Emma, and himself that was taken during one of their final days together. Richard's health deteriorates rapidly, and he's hospitalized while waiting for a donor heart. Emma visits daily, reading to him and sharing stories about Grace. During this difficult time, Richard reconnects with his stepson James, who is moved by Richard's transformation and his devotion to Emma. James begins spending time with Emma while Richard is hospitalized, creating another connection in the child's growing support network. Against the odds, a compatible donor heart becomes available. Richard undergoes the transplant surgery while Emma waits anxiously with James and Dr. Winters. The operation is successful, though recovery will be long and challenging. As Richard wakes from surgery, Emma is the first person he sees, holding his hand and telling him, "See, broken hearts can be fixed, just like Grandma said." 20 years have passed. Richard Campbell, now 74, sits in the audience at Columbia University's medical school graduation. His transplanted heart has given him 2 decades he might not have had otherwise, though his health remains fragile. Beside him sits James, now a close friend and support, with his wife and children who consider Emma their beloved aunt. On stage, Dr. Emma Campbell is receiving her medical degree with honors. She has specialized in cardiology, inspired by Richard's journey and the medical professionals who saved his life. In her graduation speech, Emma tells the story of finding discarded Italian shoes in the trash and meeting the man who would become her father. She speaks eloquently about how broken things and people can be mended with care and love, becoming more beautiful and valuable through their healing. After the ceremony, Emma embraces Richard, now white-haired but still strong in spirit. She introduces him to administrators from a new medical clinic she's helping establish in their old Boston neighborhood, designed to provide care for underserved populations. The clinic will be named in honor of Grace Palmer, the grandmother whose wisdom and love shaped both their lives. As they walk together across the campus, Emma wearing the family locket that now contains photos spanning 3 generations, Richard reflects on the unlikely journey that began with a pair of discarded shoes. He thinks about the profound truth Grace had recognized, that in saving Emma, he had ultimately saved himself. His life, which had seemed finished at 54, had instead been reborn through love and connection. Emma links her arm through his, somehow still the same perceptive child who had seen value in broken things, now grown into a compassionate healer who would carry that wisdom forward. "Ready to go home, Dad?" she asks. Richard nods, his heart, the physical one received from an unknown donor and the metaphorical one awakened by a child's love, full and complete at last. If you've made it this far, please subscribe to the channel to keep following incredible stories like this one.